The first Monday of June, I came home from work to find a moving truck angled across my driveway like a sleeping whale. The back rolled open, the ramp rattling as strangers hauled in someone else's furniture. I smelled dust and hot cardboard before I even reached the porch, and then I saw my mother-in-law's floral comforter riding past the crepe myrtle, followed by a bronze eagle statue I knew belonged on her mantel. In my own kitchen, two unfamiliar mugs clinked on my marble counters while my father-in-law called out to someone about where to plug in his recliner, and the only thing I could think was, I paid cash for this backsplash, and I have never seen those mugs in my life. I set my keys down very carefully on the entry table and said, "What is happening?" Evan's voice floated from the hallway with that faux casual tone he used when he had already decided something without me. "Hey, babe, you're early. We were going to talk about it tonight." I stepped around a stack of plastic tubs labeled with neat black letters, Darlene's Winter, toward the living room I had painted dove gray in March. My mother-in-law, in her soft-shouldered pastel cardigan, stood in front of the window like she'd grown there. "We caught you," she said with a smile that wasn't one. "Surprise." "Surprise what?" "Temporary arrangement," my father-in-law, Ron, said, wheeling his recliner toward the TV. He tested the lever and sighed when the footrest popped up like it had missed him. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Our buyers needed a quick close. Market's hot, you know how it is. I looked at Evan, whose shoulders were already hunched like a boy waiting on a principal. "We talked about this," I said. "As in, we talked about not doing this." He rubbed the back of his neck and wouldn't meet my eyes. "They sold the Conyers place faster than expected. The new build got delayed. It's just a gap." "Then a hotel," I said. "Or the rental near the Kroger. Or the extended stay off the interstate. Any of the things we said we'd do in this exact situation." Darlene opened the pantry like it had been waiting for her and tilted her head at my labeled bins of flour, sugar, coffee. "Extended stay is not safe," she said, almost to herself. "And besides, this is family. We'll help with the house. You never did finish those build-ins." "My house is finished," I said, feeling the skin between my eyebrows tighten. My house was finished the day I closed and hung my first calendar on the fridge. Evan stepped closer, palms up. "It's just for the month, Nora. First to last day. We'll get pizza. We'll watch the Braves. It'll be fine." And he lowered his voice. "Mom's doctor wants her somewhere stable for a bit. She's been dizzy." Ron snorted at that, loud enough for the movers to glance over. "She's dizzy because she doesn't eat enough salt." The movers kept walking in and out with that blank professional focus, and behind them I caught our neighbor Ty from across the cul-de-sac slowing his truck, taking in the scene, the ramp, the eagle statue, the unfamiliar sedan half on my grass. It was 92 degrees, and my blouse clung between my shoulder blades. I thought about pulling the "for sale" sign out of the garage just to see everyone's faces. I've wanted this house since I was 26 and driving the long way home just to pass it. It's a modest ranch with a deep porch and a red door, 10 minutes from the Marietta Square and close enough to hear the stadium crackle on clear nights. I'm 34 now, and last fall, after 3 years of extra shifts and taking every ugly freelance project my boss tossed to me, I bought it. The ink on the deed dried with my name alone, and I slept that first night on the floor with my jacket as a blanket because I didn't want to leave for anything. Evan and I married in January, and the house stayed mine, not because I'm secretive, but because I promised myself at 19, after my father lost our childhood place to a second mortgage, that I would always keep one thing no one could take. I told Evan that. He said he understood. He said he liked the security of me. That first week, I tried to help the situation instead of lighting it on fire. On Tuesday after work, I took Darlene to the farmer's market by the old train tracks and bought peaches that smelled like summer. On Wednesday, I cleared the hall bathroom cabinet for her pill organizer and Ron's extra toothbrush. On Thursday, I swallowed a comment about the recliner swallowing my living room's line of sight and offered to set up the guest room television so Ron could watch his fishing shows without blasting the family room soundbar. Every attempt slid off like water off a tarp. Friday before homecoming at the high school, I came home to find Darlene standing on a step stool rearranging my spice rack and Ron telling a contractor on speakerphone that I didn't need permits for a simple wall knock-through if you did it on a Saturday. You can't make changes, I said, hearing how thin I sounded. Darlene climbed down, dusted her hands, and said, "Some of these spices are expired. And your rosemary should be crushed." "I'll fix it." "It's fine," I said. "It's my house." She tilted her head in that pitying way that made me want to bite my tongue. "Sweetheart, do you hear yourself? We're all family." "Being family doesn't give you rights to my home," I said. Her smile froze. "No one said rights." Ron cupped his phone and gave me a look like he was unamused, but also bored. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. If your mother was alive, she'd tell you to be gracious." I wanted to tell him that my mother would have said, "I don't let anyone touch my kitchen, not even my sisters," and then she would have made a pot roast anyway, humming over the stove. Instead, I said, "I have boundaries." That night, when the Braves lost in the ninth and Ron clicked his tongue like the team had personally disappointed him, Evan touched my knee and whispered, "It's just a month." "It's not the time. It's the disrespect," I said quietly, without looking away from the screen. "I feel like a guest in my own house." He squeezed my knee in this rhythm he used to calm me down, and for a second, it worked. He went to bed early with a headache, and I stayed on the porch with the ceiling fan ticking and the news on low through the open window. A human interest story about a church garage sale down on Whitlock that made me want to go buy a lamp I didn't need. The second weekend, the situation found a new gear. Darlene started telling the delivery drivers to ring the back door because she didn't like the way the front bell sounded. She had my grandmother's quilt stored in a cedar box, spread across the guest bed like a picnic blanket, and when I asked her to fold it away, she told me she'd been washing quilts properly since I was in diapers. On Sunday after church, she invited 3 of her friends over to see the new place without asking me. They stood in my kitchen with the kind of tight smiles women wear around someone else's daughter-in-law and told me to try a different brand of lemon oil on the counters. Ron kept missing the hamper and tossing his clothes into the laundry room as if the floor would wash them. On Tuesday after PTA, I help run silent auctions. When my friend Kelsey ropes me in, I came home to find a handwritten list taped to the fridge in my own house. Meal plan for this week, in Darlene's careful looping script, with my grocery items crossed out and replaced. My throat went dry. I pulled the list down like it was a bandage. Evan came in from the garage, grease on his fingers from messing with the mower, and I said, "Did you tell your mother she could plan my meals?" "It's not like that," he said quickly. "She's just trying to contribute. She can contribute by buying her own yogurt and putting it on her own shelf, not the one I clear for my lunches." He wiped his hands slowly on a towel. "You're escalating." "I'm responding," I said. That same night, the first part of the truth cracked open. Around 11, I woke up to whispers under the vent and the low murmur of the TV. I padded down the hall in socks and stopped before the living room. Darlene and Evan were sitting close on the couch, the light from the lamp making their faces look too young and too old at the same time. Darlene was crying softly without tears, that quiet performative kind of cry that asks for an audience. "I promise her," she said. "I promise, Evan, you said it. You said it when you needed the help. We'd always have a room here." Evan pressed his fingers to his eyes. "I didn't think she'd. Could you just not say it in front of her?" It felt like the air thinned out. I stepped forward. "Say it in front of me now." Darlene jumped and then composed herself with unnatural speed. Evan stood, scrubbed his face, and then tried to take my hand, but I didn't give it. He said, when we were getting the place, I asked for help. The market was crazy. You had your down payment, but the inspection turned up stuff, and my student loans he swallowed. Dad and Mom fronted us 10. I stared at him. 10 what? 10,000, he said. They made me sign a note. Not with interest, just. I said they could count on having a place while their new build finished. I didn't think, Nora, I didn't think. My palms were suddenly slick. I went to the kitchen and turned on the sink because I needed the noise. You promised them space in my house to get a loan for you, I said, careful, like each word had weight. You promised them a room without asking the owner of the rooms. He followed me. I thought you'd say yes. That's the problem, I said, breathing slow. You thought for me. Ron appeared behind him, scratching his chest like the whole conversation bored him. We're not the enemies here. We're trying to help you two get on your feet as a couple. We're family. You don't nickel and dime family over rooms. I met his eyes. I have never nickel and dimed anyone over anything. I have drawn the line at my front door. He lifted his palms. Lines moved now. I didn't sleep. Wednesday morning, I straightened the duvet in the guest room with a mechanical thoroughness and smelled that lemon oil in my chest like a sting. At work, I couldn't focus on the spreadsheet in front of me. I ate a dry granola bar and tasted nothing. I clicked through the county court website once and then again, memorizing words like license to occupy and revocation, my stomach tight. At lunch, Kelsey called to ask if I could run by the school later with the basket I promised for the auction, and I said, I'll bring it at 3. I need to stand in a hallway that's not mine. By the third weekend, Darlene tried to freshen up my entryway paint with a shade that looked the same in the can and entirely wrong on my wall, 2 tones lighter, like a ghost of my original choice. I walked in from a grocery run to the smell of latex and saw that strip around the door and felt my jaw lock. Stop, I said. Stop painting my house. I was helping, she said, brush hovering. It looked scuffed. It looked lived in, I said. Put the brush down. She folded her arms. You're making a problem where there is none. Behind her, Ron told the contractor on speaker that we'd go ahead with opening the dining room next Saturday because he found a guy who would do it for cheap. My voice came out steady only because I didn't have anything left. There is no wall opening in this house without permits. There is no wall opening in this house at all. Evan came in the front door during the standoff like he'd walked into a scene he'd seen before and didn't want to be part of. What's going on? I held up the paintbrush. Your mother was painting my wall. Darlene set the brush in the tray with a little click, then wiped her hands on a paper towel that wasn't hers. We're trying to make this home presentable for company, she said. Everyone's coming over after church tomorrow. No, I said. No one is coming over. Her mouth set. You do not tell me I can't have my friends in my own home. This is not your home. And that was the moment Ron decided to call the police. He dialed with a brisk certainty that told me he'd rehearsed this. We've got a domestic disturbance, he said. My daughter-in-law is screaming and threatening to throw us out of our residence. I stopped breathing for a second. Evan reached for the phone and then didn't. Darlene backed up 2 steps and put a hand to her chest like she needed support. No one is screaming, I said quietly. But she has been told to stop altering my property, and she won't. When the officer arrived, young, careful, soft-voiced, he stood on the porch with his hands clasped and listened. He looked from me to Darlene to the paint tray on the side table. Ma'am, he said to me, are they on the lease or the deed? No, I said. They're guests. He nodded slowly. Then this is a civil matter. If you want them to leave and they refuse, you have to revoke permission and, if they're still here, go through dispossessory. We can't remove them tonight. Darlene made a sound like relief. Ron crossed his arms and leaned against the door jamb. See? He said, not hiding his satisfaction. Civil. The officer lowered his voice for me. Write down dates, times, what's being changed. Keep it factual. If anyone gets aggressive, call. But this will be paperwork. I watched him go with a mix of gratitude and a sinking feeling that tasted like old pennies. Inside, Evan said, "Can we all just be adults here?" And I said, "I am one, which is why I'm going to my office for 20 minutes to breathe." Sunday morning, I didn't go to church. I drove to the storage unit where my mother's sewing machine sat covered in an old sheet, and I ran my fingertips over the wheel until my heartbeat slowed. After lunch, I sat at the dining table with a legal pad and wrote, June 3rd, move-in. June 5th, pantry reorganization. June 8th, furniture placement without consent. June 12th, meal plan. June 15th, promise discovered. June 16th, paint incident. June 17th, 911 call. I wrote it all in neat block letters because neatness felt like control. On the last Thursday before payday, I found a small garage sale on the next street with a set of vintage picture frames I didn't need but bought anyway because I wanted to hang something that was mine. When I came home, Darlene had replaced the photo of my parents on my hallway table with a framed cross-stitch that said "Bless this mess" in cheerful blue thread. My lips went numb. I swapped them back without comment and set the cross-stitch on the console like it was waiting to be claimed. Then I took a shower twice as hot as necessary and stood there until the steam made me lightheaded. That night, just before bed, my phone lit up with a text from Evan's sister, Tasha, who almost never reached out. "You doing okay?" she wrote. "Mom says you're struggling with hospitality." I stared at the phrase, the careful dig wrapped in church language. I typed and deleted 3 versions of a reply before I wrote, "Come over. Tonight if you can. There's something you should hear." Tasha arrived in flip-flops and a hoodie, her hair up, her expression the kind you wear when you already suspect the ending. We sat on the porch with citronella candles burning and the low buzz of a game from someone's TV down the block. I told her about the note Evan had signed, about the meal plans, the paint, the police. She listened without interrupting, then reached into her tote and pulled out a paper folded small, the creases soft like she'd read it 100 times. "You're not going to like this," she said, voice tight. "But you need to see it. Dad did this to my husband and me the year we bought our townhouse. We said they could stay 1 month. She flattened the paper on her knee. They stayed 5. They told the church they were living with us for the season, and when we asked them to go, Mom told everyone I was pushing her out. We lost 2 friends over it. Finally, I got a letter from a lawyer at my job that used scary words and sent it certified. They left a week later. And Mom didn't speak to me for 3 months. I felt the porch boards under my bare feet like an anchor. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I hoped they wouldn't try it again," she said. "And Evan, he's always wanted to make them happy. I didn't think he'd promise." She hesitated. "Nora, please be careful. They're good at telling a version of the story that makes them saints and you a problem." I looked through the front window to the lamplight on my own walls. "I can live with people not liking me," I said. "I can't live with them taking my house." Tasha nodded. Her eyes shone and then blinked clear. "Then you need to do the official thing. No threats. No drama. Paper. It's the only language they respect." She slid a business card across the table, her friend's name, a real estate attorney who did closings and landlord issues. "Call her tomorrow morning. She'll tell you what to say and what not to." I put the card on top of my legal pad. Inside, the grandfather clock I rescued from a yard sale ticked calmly toward midnight. "I already started the paper," I said, touching the pad with 2 fingers. Tasha stood to go, then paused and hugged me with the kind of hug we had never had before. "I'm sorry," she said into my shoulder. "I should have warned you." When the front door clicked shut behind her, I exhaled a breath I'd been holding all month. In my head, a new phrase settled into place like a puzzle piece that made the picture make sense. Make it official. I cleaned the kitchen slowly, moving Darlene's cross-stitch to the far end of the counter and placing my parents' photo firmly back in its spot. Then I turned out the lights and went to bed with my phone face down on the nightstand. On Friday morning, over coffee that tasted like resolve, I dialed the number on the card. A calm voice answered, and I said, "My in-laws have invaded my house," and listened to the attorney say, "Okay, let's make them guests again on paper." By noon, I had a draft with firm words and dates that didn't accuse or explain. It read like something a judge would nod at: permission to occupy revoked. 36 hours to vacate or a dispossessory action will be filed. The attorney told me to send it by certified mail and to have it hand-delivered, too, because some people respect a thing only when it's in their hand with a witness. I hung up and stared at the envelope like it was a live wire. The term special delivery floated through my mind, and my pulse steadied. If they liked official, I could be official. I heard the garage door roll up and the slap of Ron's sneakers in the mudroom. Darlene's voice rose and fell in the hall. Evan was whistling something aimless, and I thought, I will not be careless with my words. I will be clean. I will be factual. Then I picked up the phone again and told the process server to meet me on the porch at 6 on Sunday, right after they got home from church, when everyone would be dressed and awake and likely to open the door. "You want it delivered with signature?" he asked. I closed my eyes and pictured the bronze eagle, the lemon oil, the recliner that had eaten my view. "Yes," I said. "Signature required." When I set the phone down, my hands weren't shaking anymore. I opened the fridge, moved Darlene's yogurt to the middle shelf, set my lunch containers back where they belonged, and wrote Nora in clear letters on the lids. The Braves game murmured on the radio in the other room, and Ty's truck rumbled past outside, the cul-de-sac making its easy loop. In my gut, the month had a shape now, not just a blur of days. First Monday to last Sunday. Start to finish. Paper to door. I kept my pen, smoothed the envelope, and waited for the weekend to begin. Sunday came wrapped in heat that made the porch rail hot under my hand, and I kept walking the same path from kitchen to entry to porch like I was wearing a groove in the hardwood. I could hear a game on 3 houses over and lawn mowers swapping turns around the cul-de-sac, and I kept checking the time not because I wanted to count the minutes, but because I needed to know I was still in charge of something. At 10, Evan put on a clean button-down and asked if I was coming to church, and I told him I had a headache and a casserole to fix, which was only half a lie. My head did ache. And the casserole was really a pan of sliced potatoes and store-bought rotisserie chicken I didn't intend to share. He hesitated in the doorway like leaving me alone in the house meant defeat, then followed his parents out, Ron jingling change in his pocket and Darlene smoothing an invisible wrinkle in her skirt. When the garage door closed, I turned on the Braves pregame show low just to have voices that didn't ask me for anything. I wiped the counters till my shoulder hurt, and I set the 2 envelopes on the console table where no one could miss them. They were exactly where I wanted them when the doorbell rang at 6 sharp. The process server had the polite, tired face of someone who had seen too many living rooms and not enough kindness. He confirmed my name, checked the numbers on his clipboard, and asked if I wanted him to handle it right there or wait on the porch for them to arrive, and I said, porch, because the porch belonged to the street as much as to me, and I wanted neighbors to see something besides a ramp and a bronze bird. Ty slowed his pickup and parked 2 doors down where you can't technically say you're watching someone's house, and he lifted a hand when I glanced over. At 6:08, I heard their car before I saw it, tires crunching the driveway where I still needed to add 1 more bag of river rock. Evan came up first with his keys out like he could unlock the moment and have it behave. Darlene behind him with that church smile that disappears the second you close the car door, and Ron last with the bulletin folded 3 times like he would keep it to read again. Evening, the server said, calm and clear. Ron and Darlene Cole? I have documents for you regarding your occupancy here. Signature required for receipt. You're served. Darlene's mouth opened and then closed like she'd swallowed something too big to chew. Ron's eyes went to Evan as if this were a prank with a hidden camera he could still walk out of. Evan looked at me, then at the envelopes, his face losing color like a print left out in the sun. Nora, he said softly. What is this? It's a formal revocation of permission, I said, and I kept my voice steady by staying close to the words the attorney had written. You have 36 hours to vacate. After that, I filed dispossessory. This protects all of us. Ron gave a sound that came from somewhere behind his teeth. We're not tenants, he said, like the word tasted bad. We're family. Family is not a legal category, the server said, businesslike but not unkind. He held out a pen. Signed here and here to confirm delivery. Evan reached like he would take the pen to make this smoother for everyone, then stopped, his hand hovering in the space between neutrality and involvement. Darlene lifted her chin. I'm not signing anything, she said, but she stepped forward and signed anyway because the man on the porch made it clear this was happening with or without her handwriting. Ron took the paper like he might tear it and then, calculating the worst outcome, wrote his name hard enough to press an impression through to the copy. The moment after they signed felt like when the air returns after a heavy truck passes your window. The server tipped his head in a kind of goodbye that was neither personal nor cold, and he walked down the steps with even steps, and the envelopes were in their hands, and their names were inked on the green cards, and something that had been foggy was now fixed. Darlene looked at the neighbors' windows and then at me. You do this to us after church, she said, not yelling, just letting the words work on me like vinegar on a stain. How could you? I did it now because I don't want yelling, I said. And you're dressed, and you're awake, and you'll remember that you were treated like adults. You have until Tuesday at 6. She blinked at the time like it was a trick. And where do you expect us to go? Inoff Delk has extended rooms, I said, and my mouth was dry, but my voice stayed level. And there's a rental on Post Oak that's month to month. I compiled options. I slid a printed sheet out from behind the console lamp and held it out like an offering that cost me nothing but pride. Ron didn't take it. This is low, he said, not loud but deep. Lower than I thought you had in you. Evan put a hand on his dad's arm like he could smooth a board with one pass. Let's talk inside. We moved into the living room with its rearranged furniture and the recliner that had the nerve to look comfortable. The envelopes sat on the coffee table between coasters from a Marietta Square art walk and a TV remote that still confused Ron. Darlene held the papers like they might stain. We have rights, she said, testing the word like a tooth. We've been here 3 weeks. The law says things about that. It does, I said. It says I can revoke permission and you have to leave or I file. That's it. She shook her head as if she were alone with me in a quiet room and could make me see her way without witnesses. I brought you chicken soup when you had the flu, she said. I mended that tear in your cardigan. I sat up with you when Evan worked late. And I thanked you for those things, I said. I will always be grateful for those things. They are not ownership. Ron pointed a folded finger at the paper like it was a map. You make this official, we make things official too. You like records? You'll have records. Okay, I said. Then we're all in agreement. Official is better than shouting. That was the first climax of the week, and I wish I could say it settled anything, but it set the next part in motion like pieces falling into place whether you want them to or not. By 9 that night, 2 women from church were at my door with a tin of brownies and the kind of concern that comes with an agenda. They asked to pray in my living room for harmony, and I said yes because prayer doesn't cost me anything and because I wanted them to see with their own eyes that there were paint chips on my entryway wall and a list on my fridge that had crossed out my groceries. After the amen, one of them said, "Maybe leave the door open to mercy," and I said, "The door is open to mercy. The door is closed to unauthorized construction," and they gave me a look like I had mixed categories. Monday morning, I went to work with my stomach tight and my phone on the desk face up, which I never do because notifications jump me like loud birds. At 10, a number I didn't recognize called, and a county permitting clerk told me that an application had been submitted in my name to remove non-load-bearing section of wall between dining and living, scheduled inspection next Saturday. I had to sit down because the room tilted a little when she said your name. I asked for the application file, and she read it, and I heard my name spelled almost right, with the kind of hesitation a hand has when it pretends it knows the signature it's copying. "Cancel it," I said, calm because anger would make me sloppy. "That is not my application. Please note the file with that exact phrase." When I hung up, my fingers felt cold even though the office was warm. I called Evan. "Did your father apply for a permit using my name?" I asked in a voice that made 3 cubicle neighbors look up without quite looking at me. He said he didn't know, then said he would ask, then said, "Please don't overreact," which told me everything, and I put the call on speaker and dialed the permitting office again so he could hear the woman say, "We recorded it as fraudulent submission, ma'am. The file is closed and there's a note." He cracked then, just a little. "I didn't know," he said, and there was a flatness in his voice that I had not heard since the night his truck died, and we had to push it 3 blocks in August. I told him not to mess with it. He said you'd come around. At lunch, Tasha met me at the sandwich shop near the courthouse with 2 iced teas and a folder with sticky flags on the top. She had printed messages from the family group chat I wasn't in, screenshots of Darlene telling her sisters that they had moved in to help the kids and that I was in a season of resistance, which was a nice way to say I wasn't a doormat. She slid another paper over like a card in a game. It was a text from 2 months ago, Evan to Darlene, "We'll always have a room for you while you build. Promise." It had a date and a time and his little gray bubble lined up neat. "He shouldn't have promised," Tasha said softly. "But a promise from a son is not a transfer of property." I filed the dispossessory that afternoon because the attorney told me to start the clock even if they moved themselves, to get it on the record in case the story changed next week. The clerk wore readers on a chain and asked if I wanted a copy stamped, which I did, and the stamp sounded louder than it should, a small square thump that made the paper a different thing than it was 10 seconds before. I called the same process server and asked him to hand-deliver the court papers tonight. "Special delivery round 2, he said, and I said yes. Same porch. Signature not required. While that moved along, the obstacles multiplied like weeds after rain. My friend Kelsey called between auction errands and said she was hearing talk, which was her gentle way of saying that 2 church ladies had implied I was cold, and a neighbor had posted on the neighborhood app that we should treat elders with respect, which was broad enough to be about dog walkers, but was absolutely about me. A distant cousin on Evan's side messaged me on social media to say family sticks together, which I almost appreciated for its purity before I deleted it without response. Ty texted to ask if I needed him home tonight in case anyone tried words on my porch, and I told him he wasn't my bouncer. But I also told him the time the server was coming because the thought of a witness who could handle his own reminded me I wasn't alone in my own street. When I pulled into the driveway at 5:40, the house looked like it always looked before this month: red door, trimmed boxwoods, the little solar lights along the walkway, even with the recliner shadowing the front window and the paint line around the door that still didn't match. Inside, I could hear the TV and the rustle of grocery bags, and I smelled that lemon oil again under the chill of the air conditioning set lower than I keep it. Darlene was at the counter wiping a spot that didn't exist, and Ron was telling the TV announcer the Braves should bunt more. Evan stood at the sink like he was waiting for directions. Papers will be here at 6:30, I said, because secrets were poison at this point. If you're gone before tomorrow night, I'll withdraw the filing. Ron laughed, but not with humor. You think your piece of paper scares me. I don't want you scared, I said. I want you not here. Darlene set the sponge down and faced me full on. You think this makes you strong, she said, and there was no breathy pity in it now, just a hard certainty that had probably gotten her through plenty of tight spots. It makes you small. Family forgives. I did forgive, I said, and I counted in my head the first week I said nothing about the pantry. The second week I rearranged the bathroom for them. The third week I told myself this was temporary while the lemon oil made my throat sting. I forgave right up until you changed my house. I forgive you still. I just won't live with you. At 6:30 on the dot, the doorbell rang again. Ty leaned on his mailbox across the street like examining a nail, which is to say he was watching without watching. The server handed Ron and Darlene the stamped dispossessory with the court date set for the Tuesday after the 4th, and this time he didn't ask for signatures. He just called their names, said served, and left. And the papers stayed on the console long enough for the hall light to make a rectangle around them. Evan blew out a breath and rubbed his temples. I can't do this, he said, and for a second I thought he meant the standoff, but then he picked up his overnight bag from the hall bench. I'm staying at Tasha's for a couple of nights. I need to think where I stand. I felt the floor under me, solid and unhelpful. Okay, I said, not because it was okay, but because the only thing worse would be begging him to stay with me while his parents called for prayers about their suffering. He moved toward me like he wanted a hug and then thought better of it. I don't hate you, he said, trying to give me something that sounded kind, and then he was down the steps and in his car and out of the driveway like a teenager leaving a house he didn't pay for. The taillights hit the mailbox and the little solar lights and Ty's boots, and then they were at the corner, and then they were gone. I stood in the hallway long enough for the hall sensor light to time out and leave me in a dim that felt like the edges of a picture. Darlene picked up the papers with a hand that shook now that there wasn't an audience, and Ron sat harder in the recliner, like he could make his weight more persuasive. The TV turned to local news. Thunderstorms headed for Cobb County, a story about a church garage sale moving inside because of heat, and the anchor's pleasant voice ran a calm line under the quiet. A minute later, Darlene spoke without looking at me. You will regret this, she said. Everyone who knows you will see what you did. Maybe, I said. Maybe not. I walked to the fridge, reached up, and straightened the magnet holding my parents' photo. Either way, the record will say what happened. That night I slept with the bedroom door locked because even paper doesn't keep you from waking at 2 to the sound of water running and the worry your pipes have burst, which turned out to be Ron rinsing a dish with more force than any dish needs. I put my pillow over my head, then threw it on the floor because I needed to hear. In the morning, the house smelled like coffee and that lemon oil Darlene used like it paid her, and the trash can was full of takeout containers that none of us wanted to claim. At 8, a text from the attorney pinged my phone. Sheriff's office can take trespass letter once they vacate. Keeps things smooth if they try to return without permission. I stared at the words, and the idea of trespass letter settled in the place in my chest where fear had been sitting. Not revenge like a movie, just a boundary made permanent by ink and a file number. By noon, Darlene had called 3 friends and her sister to tell them the version of the truth where she was giving up her room for the sake of peace, and by 2, one of those friends had posted a verse about long suffering on social media with a heart emoji. I turned my phone face down and loaded a trunk with the first plastic tubs they stacked near the door, Darlene's winter, and I carried them outside one at a time without asking permission, because I was done asking. Ty walked over like he had decided to stretch his legs at the exact moment a tub needed lifting. "You want these in your trunk or at the curb?" he asked, and I said, "Driveway," and he nodded like this was a normal chore between neighbors. Darlene watched from the doorway and said nothing. Ron went silent the way some men go loud. He stood with his arms crossed and looked at the TV without watching it, and I ignored him. By late afternoon, the living room had more of my lines back, less of the recliner, more of the gray rug I'd picked because it made rainy mornings feel quiet, and the house sounded different too. Like when you take the knickknacks off a shelf and the room suddenly has room to breathe. Evan didn't text, which hurt in a way that made my collarbone feel heavy. I made a sandwich I didn't want and ate half of it standing up. At 5, my doorbell rang again, and for a second my stomach dropped because I thought Darlene had called for reinforcements. But it was Tasha holding 2 rolls of packing tape and a bag of takeout from the place on Church Street where the fries always taste like they've been waiting exactly as long as you have. She didn't say, "I told you so," or "I'm sorry." She set the tape on the table and said, "I'm here to pack up the linen closet," and I nodded and handed her a Sharpie without speaking. We worked until dusk, the ceiling fans going faster than usual, boxes labeled in block letters, the sound of tape ripping, and the soft thud of folded towels. Darlene collected her jewelry and the framed cross-stitch without argument and put them in a tote. Ron muttered something about back pain and disappeared to the guest room and did not come out for 20 minutes. The Braves lost by 1 after a rally that had everyone on the street sighing at once, and that felt about right. Around 9, Tasha hugged me with her chin against my shoulder, the kind of hug a sister gives when words run out. "Tomorrow by 6, she said, and I nodded. When she left, the house settled around the remaining noise. Darlene's phone buzzed on the counter, a text from someone named Marlene. "Do not give in. She's trying to embarrass you." Darlene read it and set the phone down slowly, like she wanted me to see without admitting she wanted me to see. I washed the last plate and placed it on the rack with precision that would have made my mother nod. I had a plan for the morning: call the sheriff's office and ask what a trespass letter needed in this county, confirm the timeline with the attorney, remind myself not to argue even if they tried a final scene. I went to bed with my phone on Do Not Disturb, the hall light off, the front door locked with a deadbolt that clicks like a clock. The house felt closer to itself. The record would say what happened. The porch had held 2 deliveries in 2 days and would hold 1 more before I let the month end on my schedule, not anyone else's. Tuesday started with a sky the color of dishwater and heat that pressed low, and I woke before my alarm because my mind was already counting hours, and the sound I noticed first was nothing loud. Just the tired hum of the air conditioner trying to keep up and the stifled clink of mugs in the kitchen, and I kept my door closed for 3 slow breaths before I opened it because I wanted to pick the pace of the day and not let it pick me. And then I walked down the hall with my shoulders back the way my mother taught me when I had to say something I couldn't take back, and in the kitchen Darlene stood with her church bulletin folded under her phone and Ron had the weather on, and it smelled like coffee and lemon oil because it always did now. And I said good morning like we were in an office and not in the center of a fight, and then I picked up the stamped copy of the filing and slid it into the top drawer of the console like a chef putting a knife away where it belongs because touching the paper grounded me, and then I told them I had to be at the courthouse by 9 because the docket was set and the clerk wanted everyone on time, and Darlene said she needed until the afternoon because she had errands with a friend. And I said the deadline was 6 and I wasn't moving it, and if you've ever had a conversation where every word is accurate and still everything underneath it is a wave, then you know how that morning tasted in my mouth, flat and metallic, and I grabbed my keys and left before I said something that would make any of this uglier than it had to be. The Cobb County Courthouse sits 5 miles from the square if you cut over by the library and avoid the school zones, and I parked in the deck where it always smells like oil and paper and walked into a building full of people who looked like they'd all rather be anywhere else. And that made it easier, because no one waited to see me succeed or fail. They were coping with their own forms and their own quiet disasters, and when my case was called, the judge didn't smile or frown. She just looked at the file and then at me and asked if this was my residence and whether I had given the other parties permission to be there and whether I had revoked it in writing. And I said yes and yes and yes, and she asked if they were on any lease or the deed, and I said no. And she asked if they'd been served and whether they had responded, and I said they had been served and they had not filed any response, and she nodded once like she'd put this kind of puzzle together 100 times, and then she asked if I wanted to continue in case they were moving voluntarily, and I said no because I wanted the record to speak if the story got changed later in a way that left me chasing it. And somewhere in the middle of this, Evan arrived and sat in the back without walking up, and when the judge asked if anyone else wanted to be heard, he stayed in his seat with his hands together the way he does when he prays. And the judge granted a writ of possession with a date certain and told me to coordinate with the sheriff if I needed help, and the clerk stamped a paper that looked like all the other papers and still felt different when it touched my hand. And I said thank you because gratitude costs nothing. And I walked out without looking back at Evan because I didn't have anything kind or useful to say in that hallway. And when I got to the car, I sat with the door open and the heat hitting my face, and I let my hands shake until they stopped. By noon, the sky had turned hazy and neighborhood fireworks stands were already stacking crates for the weekend. And I drove home with the Braves pregame on again because the steady talk gave my mind a track. And when I pulled into the driveway, the bronze eagle on the console by the front door had been turned toward the wall in a quiet little display of defiance that didn't land the way it was meant to. And I picked it up and set it in the foyer with the boxes labeled Darlene's Winter and Ron's Tackle like a prop waiting for the next scene, and then I ate a piece of toast dry because I couldn't think about what comes with toast, and I checked the time and counted backward from 6 in hours and minutes like I was studying for a test. And if someone had asked me in that moment what revenge felt like, I would have said it felt like a set of choices made in daylight that did not require anyone to raise their voice. At 4, there was a new attempt to change the script, because that's how it goes when someone has been winning the small daily battles for so long. And Darlene said a friend from church had a lead on a sublet, but needed a couple of days to clear it, and asked whether I could extend the deadline until Friday morning, because kindness is a habit, and she knew how to make me reach for it. And I took a sip of water and said no and told her I had already offered to withdraw the filing if they left by 6, and that was the offer, and it was staying put, and she nodded like she was documenting my lack of flexibility for later, and then she went into the guest room and closed the door. And Ron muttered to himself about back injuries and unfairness, and how none of this would have happened in his day, and I said nothing because every word past the ones that mattered made their version stronger. And at 5 after 5, a text buzzed from the process server saying the writ was queued if needed, and the sheriff had a unit available within the hour, which was both reassuring and sad because it meant this wasn't theater. This was a line on a dispatcher's screen. At 5:40, the driveway filled with the sound of plastic bins sliding on truck bed liner and the scrape of the recliner feet over the threshold. And Ty eased his truck into the cul-de-sac the way people do when they want to be exactly where they are without turning themselves into a witness on purpose. And Tasha showed up in a car I didn't recognize and went straight to the linen closet without asking questions. And I stood in the living room and counted every item that passed the doorway because I needed to be able to say later exactly what had left and exactly what had stayed. And I took pictures on my phone of the rooms with the timestamp showing because the attorney had said that kind of thing closes doors other people try to open later. And at 5:58, Darlene stood in the entry with the bulletin still folded under her phone and told me she wanted to leave a few boxes in the garage just until morning, and I said the deadline was 6 and the answer was no, and that if they needed a little more time to load the truck, I was willing to wait on the porch for another 30 minutes, provided everything they owned was on the concrete by 6 o'clock. And she stared at me with eyes that were tired and angry and something else I didn't want to name. And she said this was not how she pictured the month of June with her children and grandchildren moving forward in love. And I told her the picture had always been of my red door and my porch and the sound of a game through an open window, and her presence had been a misunderstanding. And then Ron flipped the recliner lever one last time like an exclamation point before Ty helped him get it into the truck. And at 6:11 the house was quiet except for the ceiling fan and my breath and the faintest noise from someone's radio 2 houses down. I didn't file the writ because I keep my promises even when the other side never meant to keep theirs. So first thing Wednesday morning, I went to the clerk and withdrew the case with a line on the form that said moot. And then I drove to the sheriff's office and spoke with a deputy with a soft voice and a tired patience. And I told him I wanted a criminal trespass warning on file for Ron and Darlene, and that I wanted it delivered in person by law enforcement. And he nodded and asked for full names and dates of birth and a description of the property and whether there were any safety concerns. And I gave him the facts and not my feelings because feelings don't get logged. And he set a time for Friday afternoon when they would be returning to pick up the Bronze Eagle and the last 3 tubs that hadn't fit in the truck. And he said he would be there and would warn them in clear terms that they were not to step onto my porch or into my yard without my express consent, and that violation would mean arrest, and he called it a permanent notice, which is a phrase that sounds simple until you need it, and then it sounds like the air in a room after someone closes a window against a storm. Thursday felt empty in a way that made every sound loud, and I went to work and finished a report that had been waiting in my inbox since Memorial Day, and at lunch Kelsey said she hoped I was breathing, and I told her I was breathing and also eating. And she laughed and handed me a muffin someone brought to the PDA office, and I didn't eat the whole thing, but I kept it on my desk because it reminded me that people still did small decent things without making an announcement, and after work I went home and cleaned the guest room until it looked like a hotel in a good way and not a place where anyone else's plans were allowed to set up camp, and I ran 2 loads of laundry without anyone's socks falling out. And I stood at the entry and looked at that wrong paint line around the door and gave myself permission to fix it later with the right shade. And I slept with the door unlocked for the first time since the first Monday of the month and woke up once to the sound of sprinklers and then went back to sleep without reaching for my phone, which felt like more progress than any paper ever made. Friday arrived with a heat advisory and a sky that threatened rain without delivering it, and at 3 on the dot the deputy parked across the street so as not to block the driveway. And Ty wandered to his mailbox at the exact moment the old sedan pulled in and Darlene stepped out in sunglasses and Ron in a t-shirt, and the deputy didn't put his hand on his belt or act like this was a scene for TV. He just spoke in that tone officials use when they intend to be obeyed, and he explained that the property owner had requested a criminal trespass warning and that it was now in effect, and that they were permitted right then to retrieve the items set on the porch, and that any future attempt to enter without permission would lead to arrest. And Ron began to argue and then stopped because the deputy held his gaze without blinking, and Darlene said she had never in her life been treated like a criminal, and the deputy said no one was calling her that, and that the purpose of the warning was to avoid exactly that outcome, and then he handed each of them a printed copy, and I will not pretend I didn't register the sound the paper made when their hands took it or the way Darlene's fingers tightened on the edge, and I will not pretend the words, permanent unless rescinded by the owner, didn't make my shoulders drop 3 inches in relief, because they did, and then Ron lifted the Bronze Eagle like it weighed more than it did, and Darlene took the tubs with the winter clothes and a cross, stitch, and a set of picture frames I had moved to the far side of the console to be kind, and they left without saying anything to me even though I was standing right there. When they were gone, the deputy asked if I wanted a case number, and I said yes, and he wrote it on a small card and told me to keep it somewhere I could find it when my hands were shaking, because that is when people forget where they put things. And I thanked him and went inside and put the card in the drawer with the stamped copy of the filing and the attorney's business card and the paint chips with the correct color, and then I stood in the middle of my living room and looked at the open wall. That was still a wall, and the entry that waited for the right shade, and the empty space where the recliner had told me what to watch, and the silence after that wasn't empty in a bad way. It was empty like a room before a party when you can hear your own breathing. I didn't see Evan until Sunday afternoon when the church crowd was easing off and the sound of forks on plates drifted across yards. And he parked on the street instead of in the driveway and walked to the porch like he had been rehearsing what he would say, and the rehearsal hadn't produced something simple enough. And I met him at the door but didn't invite him in because I wasn't ready to mix the talk with the smell of my lemon soap or the sight of the rug I picked, and he said he was sorry, without any qualifiers, and he said he hadn't understood how much of this felt like the ground under my feet, and he said he had told his parents that he had chosen wrong and that his promise to them was not a promise he ever had the right to make. And his voice broke once when he said Tasha had told him the story of her townhouse, and he hadn't listened then, and he was listening now, and I believed him and I didn't, which is a hard place to stand but honest, and he asked if we could try to make a plan that included counseling and a timeline and me having the only keys for a while and his parents agreeing in writing that they would not step on this property without my invitation. And I told him he could type that, and I would sign it, and they could sign it, and the sheriff already had the warning on file, and that wasn't changing for at least a year, and he nodded and said he understood. And we stood there with the ceiling fan pushing warm air down and the smell of rain that still hadn't arrived, and I told him I wanted a week to myself without plans, and he said he would stay with Tasha. And he asked if he could bring me the good peaches from the market even though Darlene had bought them with me once, and I said yes, because peaches are not guilty of anything. And then he handed me his old copy of my house key, and I put it in my pocket, and I did not tell him whether I had changed the locks, because I wanted one secret to be mine again. The week after the 4th moved slower than I expected because the space that conflict leaves behind is bigger than the conflict itself. And I worked regular hours and watched a couple of innings most nights and put my phone on the charger in the kitchen like a normal person. And one evening I went to the garage and found a stack of paint trays I hadn't thrown out because part of me had hoped the wrong line around the door would stop bothering me, and I drove to the hardware store and held the paint chip under the fluorescent lights the way you're supposed to and bought a quart of the right shade with money I had put aside months ago, and on the last Thursday before payday I taped the trim and rolled the color in slow even strokes. And the smell was not pleasant, but it was mine, and the line disappeared the way a bruise looks better in the afternoon. And I texted Tasha a photo, and she sent back 3 heart emojis and the words, "looks like home," and it did. 2 Sundays later, the church news bulletin had a small note about a family in need of a month-to-month rental while their new build wrapped up, and it did not say their names, but it didn't have to, and I felt the old pull to defend myself to people who weren't asking. And I put the bulletin down and went out to the porch and watched Ty replace a mailbox that had leaned since March, and he tipped his hat in a neighbor way and said I could borrow his level if I ever needed it, and I said I would, and inside the house the Braves were up by 2, and the afternoon light hit the picture of my parents on the hall table just right so that the faces looked clearer than they had in a while. And I thought about calling my father and telling him I had kept my promise to myself, and I poured iced tea over a glass full of ice, and the sound was the best thing I had heard all day. If you asked me what my revenge was, I would not say it was the look on anyone's face or the hush in a room after a paper gets handed over. I would say it was the day I arranged a special delivery and then another, and then one more. Each one carrying a boundary that did not need to shout to be real, and I would say it was the permanent notice tucked in a drawer with a case number written in short, neat numbers that fit on a wallet card, and I would say it was the long, simple act of putting my house back in order without calling it triumph, because it wasn't. It was repair, and repair is its own kind of ending. Evan and I met with a counselor the Tuesday after PDA because Tuesdays seem to be the day our life resets, and we told the whole truth in a small room with an old rug and a box of tissues we didn't use. And I said I would not be the person who gets smoothed over in the name of peace, and he said he had been that son and he didn't want to be that husband, and none of that is a neat vow, but it is a start that doesn't cost me my porch or my name on the deed. And if that sounds cold to anyone who has not stood in a kitchen with lemon oil stinging their nose and a list taped to the fridge that replaces their groceries, then we can agree to disagree. The last Sunday of the month, I set a new photo in a thrifted frame from the garage sale on the next street, a picture of Tasha and me with packing tape on our wrists like bracelets. And I put the bronze eagle's empty spot to use with a small plant that doesn't mind low light, and the room felt uncluttered without feeling empty, and the quiet in the evening was not tense. It was the quiet a person earns after a long day of work that no one else claps for, and when the ceiling fan clicked on its chain, I didn't flinch because it was only a fan and not a footstep, and when I turned off the news, I didn't worry about who might be upset by the choice, and the house made the soft settling noises that old houses make when the air goes cooler. And if you want an ending with fireworks, you can look in someone else's window, but if you want one with a porch and a red door and a woman who didn't hand over her keys, then this is it, and the record says what happened and the paper is permanent and the rest is between me and the people who live here, which is to say me for now, and that is enough.